The wig itched under the June sun, and I was still smiling when I heard my sister say it. "It's giving costume, not cancer," Denise said to the cluster of mothers by the lemonade table, tilting her head toward me like I was a display at a party store. A few of them laughed the polite, uncertain kind of laugh people make when they're not sure if they're allowed to. My mother, standing 2 feet away holding a paper plate of cake, didn't correct her. She just cut another slice for herself and said nothing at all. I was at my niece Callie's 7th birthday party, in a backyard strung with pink balloons, wearing the same synthetic blonde wig I'd worn to 11 chemo sessions, and I had spent the last 2 hours being told, in one way or another, that my illness was inconvenient for the occasion. My name is Margaret Voss. I'm 41, and 6 months earlier I'd been diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. This is the story of the day I finally stopped absorbing my family's cruelty quietly, and the trust fund none of them knew I controlled. To understand that backyard, you have to understand what came before it. I was the middle child in a family that had never quite figured out what to do with me. My older brother Wallace got the attention that came with being first. My younger sister Denise got the attention that came with being the baby, and then, later, with being the one who had it together, the one with the good marriage, the tidy house, the daughter everyone adored. I got very little attention at all, and somewhere in my 20s I stopped expecting it. When I got sick, I told myself things might shift. Illness has a way of clarifying who shows up for you. I was wrong about which direction that clarity would go. My mother, Eleanor, drove me to exactly 1 chemo appointment, the first one, and spent most of it in the waiting room complaining to a stranger about how her whole week had been thrown off. Wallace sent a single text that read, "Hope you feel better soon," and never mentioned it again. Denise was worse than either of them, not through absence, but through a steady stream of comments dressed up as concern. "You're being so brave about this," she'd say at family dinners, in a tone that suggested bravery was mildly embarrassing. Or, "I just don't understand why you have to talk about it so much," when I mentioned a scan result in passing. Once at Easter, she told our cousin that I'd always had a flair for drama, and that this was, in her words, on brand. I stopped bringing it up. I went to appointments alone. I lost my hair alone, in my bathroom, over 3 days in April, watching clumps collect in the sink while nobody in my family called to check on me. I bought the wig myself, a decent one, not cheap, from a specialty shop that understood what it meant to a person to look in the mirror and recognize themselves again. My grandmother, Augusta Bell, was the only one who ever asked real questions. She called every week, sometimes twice. She wanted to know about the nausea, the fatigue, whether the new medication was working, whether I was eating. She was 86 and sharp as anything, and she was the last person in my family who still made me feel like a person instead of an inconvenience. Augusta had been unwell herself for the past year, quietly, without much fuss. She passed in early May, 3 weeks before Callie's birthday party. I flew back for the funeral balled under a scarf, still finishing radiation, and sat through a service where my mother cried loudly in the front row, and my sister gave a eulogy about Augusta's famous peach cobbler without once mentioning the woman's actual character. At the reading of the will, 2 days after the funeral, a small piece of information passed by so quickly I almost missed its weight. Augusta had left her house in Millbrook to a trust, administered by an attorney named Harold Denning, with the beneficiary listed only as family at the trustee's discretion. Nobody asked who the trustee was. Wallace assumed it would default to my mother, since she was the oldest child. Denise assumed nothing, because Denise assumed the house would simply become available to her the way most things did. I said nothing, because at the time I didn't know either. I found out 3 days before Callie's party. Harold Denning called my cell while I was sitting in my car outside a pharmacy waiting for a prescription refill. "Ms. Voss, I need to go over something with you directly," he said. "Your grandmother named you sole trustee of the family trust. That includes the Millbrook property and its associated accounts. She was quite specific about the terms." I sat in that parking lot for a long time after he hung up, the engine off, my hands resting on the wheel. My grandmother had watched me get sick. She had watched exactly how my family responded to it, and in the last document she ever signed, she had quietly handed me the one thing that gave me leverage over people who had spent months making me feel small. I called my oncology nurse, a woman named Priya, who had seen me through 11 infusions and knew more about my family dynamics than any of my actual relatives, purely from the things I'd said out loud during long hours in the infusion chair. I told her about the call from Harold Denning, and she was quiet for a moment before she said something I kept turning over for days afterward. "You've spent this whole illness being careful with everyone else's feelings," she said. "Maybe it's time to be careful with your own instead." I didn't tell anyone in my family. Not yet. I went to Callie's birthday party 3 days later because I loved my niece, and because some habits of showing up don't disappear just because the people around you haven't earned it. The backyard was decorated the way Denise decorated everything, expensively and a little too much. Pastel balloons arched over a dessert table, a bounce house rented for the occasion, 30 guests milling around with paper plates. I arrived in my wig, a sundress, and the kind of tired that lives in your bones after radiation, and I lasted about 40 minutes before the first comment landed. It came from a woman I didn't know well, a friend of Denise's from the neighborhood, who asked, not unkindly but carelessly, whether my hair was a fun summer thing. Before I could answer, Denise laughed and said, "It's giving costume, not cancer," loud enough for the cluster of mothers around the lemonade table to hear. My mother, standing close enough to have heard every word, cut herself another piece of cake and said nothing. I stood there in the sun, the wig suddenly feeling heavier than it had all morning, and I understood something I had been circling for months without letting myself land on it directly. This wasn't a bad day. This was who they were, consistently, and I had simply run out of reasons to excuse it. I didn't make a scene. I never had, not once, in 41 years of being the family's designated absorber of small cruelties. I finished my lemonade, watched Callie blow out her candles, hugged her goodbye, and drove home with both hands steady on the wheel and my mind entirely somewhere else. That night I called Harold Denning back. "I want to move forward with the trust," I told him. "All of it, as written." "Are you certain?" he asked. "Once we formalize occupancy and start managing the accounts under your discretion, your family will need to be notified officially. There won't be an easy way to walk it back." I thought about the wig. I thought about my mother cutting cake instead of speaking. I thought about 11 chemo sessions I'd sat through alone while my sister called me dramatic for mentioning them. "I'm certain," I said. It took Harold 9 days to prepare the paperwork. In that time, I didn't call my mother or my sister, and neither of them called me, which told me everything I needed to know about how much that afternoon had registered with them at all. When the documents were ready, I didn't send them by mail. I asked Harold to schedule a meeting at his office and told my family there was something regarding Augusta's estate we needed to discuss in person. They arrived expecting a formality, some paperwork to sign, maybe a discussion about dividing furniture. My mother wore her good blazer. Denise brought a folder of her own, filled with photographs of the Millbrook house's kitchen, already mentally renovating a space that had never been offered to her. Harold laid out the terms plainly. The house and its associated accounts, roughly $300,000, had been placed in trust under my sole administration, per Augusta's explicit written instruction. I could authorize use of the property. I could authorize distributions. I was under no obligation to consult anyone. "This has to be a mistake," my mother said, her voice thin. "I'm her daughter. This should have gone to me." "It's not a mistake," Harold said. She was very deliberate about the language. I discussed it with her personally, twice, before she signed. Denise's composure cracked faster than my mother's. "You did this," she said, turning to me. "You went behind everyone's back." "I didn't go behind anyone's back," I said. "Grandma made this decision. I only found out 3 days before Callie's party." The room went quiet at that. I watched my sister's face change as she did the math. 3 days before the party, the same afternoon she'd stood by the lemonade table and called my illness a costume in front of a dozen women she barely knew. "That's not fair," she said. "You're punishing us for one comment." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said. "I'm simply not required to hand either of you access to something that was never yours to begin with. That's not punishment. That's just what happens when you spend 6 months treating someone's cancer like a personal inconvenience, and it turns out that someone controls the family trust." My mother tried a different approach, softer, the tone she used when she wanted something. "Margaret, we're family. Surely we can find a way to share this." "We are family," I said. "That's exactly why I know how you'll treat something you're given access to. I watched you cut yourself a second piece of cake while my own sister mocked me in front of strangers. I don't need to guess what you'll do with a house." Wallace, who had said almost nothing the entire meeting, finally spoke. "I didn't say anything at the party. I wasn't even standing there." "You've said nothing for 6 months, I told him. "That's its own answer." I stood, thanked Harold, and told my family I'd be in touch regarding any updates to the trust, though I made no promises about timing. I walked out of that office without raising my voice once, because I had learned, finally, that volume was never the thing that made a point land. The truth did that on its own. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way my family's silences had never been before. Less punishment, more absence of performance. My mother called once to ask if there was room for compromise. I told her the terms were exactly as Augusta had written them, and that I wasn't inclined to renegotiate a dying woman's clearly stated wishes on behalf of people who couldn't be bothered to ask how my treatment was going. Denise texted me at midnight, accusing me of using the party as an excuse to seize control out of spite. I read it once and didn't respond. Some messages don't need an answer, only silence loud enough to speak for itself. Wallace tried a different route. He showed up at my apartment one Saturday, unannounced, holding a coffee he clearly meant as a peace offering. I let him in because he was the one who had at least admitted his silence had been its own kind of failure. "I keep thinking about what you said," he told me, sitting stiffly on my couch. "That my not saying anything at the party was its own answer. I've been trying to figure out what I would have even said if I had spoken up." "That's the point," I told him. "You had 6 months to figure that out, and you didn't need me sick at a birthday party to prompt it." He didn't argue. He finished his coffee, apologized in a way that felt more honest than anything my mother or sister had managed, and asked if he could visit the Millbrook house sometime, not to stay, just to see it. I told him he could, as long as he came alone and didn't bring an agenda. He came twice that fall, and both times he simply helped me clear brush from the back fence line and didn't mention the trust once. My last scan came back clear in August. I told my family through a group text, the same way they had so often communicated with me, brief and impersonal. Nobody called. Denise sent a thumbs-up emoji. My mother didn't respond at all. I spent that September in Millbrook, in my grandmother's house, sitting on the same porch where she used to call me every week to ask about my nausea and my appetite and whether I was eating enough. I hung new curtains. I planted bulbs along the front walk that wouldn't bloom until spring, a small bet on a future I hadn't been sure I would get to see when this all began. Callie visited once, brought by a babysitter my sister arranged rather than come herself, and I taught her to skip stones on the little pond behind the house while she asked me questions about my hair growing back in soft and dark instead of the light brown it used to be. "Why didn't Grandma Augusta just tell everyone the house was yours?" she asked me, sitting cross-legged on the dock. I thought about that for a long moment before I answered. "Because she knew real protection doesn't announce itself," I said. "It waits quietly until the exact moment it's needed most, and then it shows up right when you finally don't need anyone else's permission to be safe." I never went back to being the person who absorbed things quietly. I still show up to family events sometimes, mostly for Callie, and I still wear the wig when I want to, though my own hair has mostly grown back now, shorter than before and a little more gray, and I've decided I like it that way. Nobody at those gatherings makes comments about costumes anymore. They've learned, slowly and without ever fully admitting it, that the woman they spent months dismissing turned out to be the one holding all the keys.